everyone, it's Michelle here. Welcome back to GroundedHaven Homestead. In this video, I'm going to show you some meals that we ate last week. We're going to be making some homemade pasta and noodles, as well as a bunch of other egg-based recipes. We have been eating a lot of eggs around here lately because when you're getting 8 or 9 eggs a day and you only have 2 people in your house, you really have to find ways to eat eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So let's get into the recipes. First, I'm going to start off by making an egg pasta dough that I'm going to be using for 2 different meals. I'm starting off with 2 cups of flour, half a teaspoon of salt, and 2 eggs. And I'm going to be mixing this up in my food processor. It just cuts down on some of the kneading time and a lot of the hard work of making pasta. I have a dough blade in my food processor, but if yours doesn't have one, I believe you can just use a normal blade as well. So we're going to pulse this up just to get those eggs broken up and starting to incorporate into that flour. And this probably won't be quite enough liquid to start getting the flour to form a ball, so I'm going to slowly drizzle in water, and eventually the dough will start to clump up and it'll start forming a ball that's going to spin all around, and you really want to make sure you don't walk away and hold onto your food processor, because once it forms that ball, it's going to get a little bit aggressive and you don't want your food processor to walk off the counter. So I'm going to let that go in the food processor for a few minutes to really get that gluten forming. The more gluten the better, because this is going to give our noodles a nice bouncy texture. Since I'm going to be doing 2 batches of this, and that was just 1 batch, I just set it aside under a towel, and I'm going to be doing the same exact thing. 2 cups of flour, half a teaspoon of salt, and 2 eggs, and mixing that up in the food processor again. And now, taking each ball of dough at a time, I'm going to give it a few more kneads with my hands. Anytime I make dough in a stand mixer or in a food processor, I still like to give it that last little finishing touch just to make sure everything is feeling really good. When you press into the dough, it should bounce back immediately and feel very bouncy. That's how you know that enough gluten has formed. For one of these balls of dough, I'm just going to place it in a reusable silicone bag, and I'm going to stick this in the fridge to use for another recipe later on. You can also wrap this in plastic wrap, but I just try and cut down on my plastic whenever possible. I'm going to do the same thing with the other ball of dough, just giving it a few kneads by hand, and this one is the one I'm going to be using for the meal today. So I'm going to wrap that in plastic wrap and set it aside, and this needs to rest for at least 30 minutes before we try and roll this out, otherwise it's just going to bounce back and it's not going to roll out nicely. The meal that I'm going to make first is a noodle dish, and the soup base is going to be a Japanese dashi. And I've shown this dish before, but I haven't shown how to make the dashi, so I wanted to show how to do that today. I am doubling the dashi recipe that I use, so I have 8 cups of water in a pot, and I'm going to put 2 4x4 inch size pieces of kelp in there. And I'm going to boil this until the water is just starting to simmer, and when it's starting to simmer, I'm going to take that kelp out. You don't really want to boil it for too long because kelp can get a little bit slimy and you don't really want that texture in your broth. I'm going to set that kelp aside, don't throw it out, because we are going to use it for another recipe later on as well. And then to finish off this broth, I'm going to be adding some katsuobushi, which is also known as bonito flakes, which are smoked and dried tuna flakes. You should be able to find this at any Asian grocery, but I've also seen this sold at Whole Foods or more specialty grocery stores like that. And I'm going to add 2 nice size handfuls into the broth, and that is pretty much it. It's just 2 ingredients, and it just has so much flavor and it's so delicious, especially those katsuobushi flakes. They have such a savory, smoky flavor, and they are so good. This makes for a really good soup base, which is how I'm going to be using it today, but it's also used in a lot of other Japanese recipes, which I'm going to start experimenting with. So hopefully I'll be able to share that soon. And I like to double this recipe whenever I make it because I can stick half of it in the freezer for later use, and it's just as easy to make twice as much as it is to make 1 batch. If there's some foam that you're getting from either the kelp or the katsuobushi, you can just skim that off to give you a nice clear broth. I'm gonna bring this back up to a boil and then cover my pot. And then after I cover my pot, I'm gonna turn off the heat and let this sit for about 15 minutes so that all those flavors can infuse really nicely. So here we are after 15 to 20 minutes. The dough has been resting and the broth has been infusing. I'm going to fish out all of the solids in my broth, and I'm going to save those katsuobushi flakes along with the kelp to make a homemade furikake seasoning later. And I'm just gonna strain everything out and we're left with our homemade dashi. By now the dough has rested enough so I can start rolling out my noodles. I'm sprinkling my dough and my cutting board with some cornstarch to prevent it from sticking, and I'm just gonna roll these noodles out by hand. It really doesn't take very long at all because I'm not trying to get these super thin. So I find a rolling pin works just fine. The amount of work that it takes to roll this out is still less than pulling out my pasta maker, so I am happy to do this by hand. I'm just gonna try and roll this pretty much as thin as I can go, but not trying to get it like paper thin either. I'm aiming for maybe about 1/8 of an inch thick. These are gonna be really thick noodles that are kind of like the texture and width of udon noodles. The only difference is that these noodles do have eggs in the dough rather than udon noodles that are just flour and water. After my dough is rolled out as thin as I would like it, I'm going to be using my pizza cutter to slice out my noodles. Just trying to go as straight as possible and keep an even width for each of my noodles. If you don't want to do this by hand, you can also just fold your dough onto itself a couple of times and use a knife to create those noodles as well. After I've cut a handful of noodles, I like to sprinkle these with more cornstarch and just shake them out a little bit to make sure that each noodle is separated and that it doesn't stick to each other as it sits. Meanwhile, I'm getting some boiling water in my pot ready to boil my noodles. I'm not going to boil them in the dashi. I like to do it separately in fresh water. That way the pasta doesn't release all of that starch into our dashi because we want to have a nice clean broth to cover the noodles with afterwards. Once all my noodles are cut and my water is boiling, I'm gonna stick all of my noodles in here, and because these noodles are so thick, they will have to boil for quite a long time. The first time I made these, I probably only boiled them for about 5 minutes, which was not enough. Even though they were like pretty much cooked, I like them to get like really soft because then they're more flexible and they're easy to eat. So I probably ended up boiling these for 10 to 15 minutes. When they're done, they'll be really nice and puffy and soft. and they were much better than the first time I made these. But to be honest, these noodles are actually better the day after. I will usually store this in some of the broth, and as it sits in the fridge, it will absorb more of that broth, and when you go to reheat it, they are really nice and plump. We also went outside and harvested some tatsoi from our green stalk. It was snowing that day, so this noodle soup I thought was going to be the perfect meal for this cold winter day, and this tatsoi will just be a nice addition of greens in our noodle soup. This tatsoi is still a little bit small, and this is actually our first harvest, so I definitely wish that they were a little bit bigger, but I was excited to try them, and I just thought that they would be great for this meal. So I went ahead and harvested a bunch of those, and I'm separating the leaves off of each plant. So here the noodles are after 10 to 15 minutes. You can see how they've gotten really plump and puffy. And I'm just going to scoop these out directly into our bowls. And once the noodles are out of the pot, I've emptied out any of that starchy water, and now I'm going to take a few ladlefuls of our finished homemade dashi, and I'm just going to put that in the pot really quickly so that it can reheat up a little bit. I'm also going to add our tatsoi greens in here just for about a minute while everything heats up so that the greens can wilt down a little bit. And the tatsoi ended up being really delicious. They were really sweet, I think because they've been outside all winter, and this was our first time growing it, so I'm definitely happy with how those taste. Once that broth is nice and reheated again and the tatsoi greens have wilted a little bit, we can just ladle these over our noodles. They should still be pretty warm, but just ladling that hot broth on top will just rewarm them once again. I also added a tea egg to each of these bowls, which I've shown how to make in a video before. I'll link that in the cards and also in the description box. And that runny yolk and that delicious tea and soy sauce flavor goes so well with this noodle bowl. I also like to finish this off with a mixture of soy sauce, sesame oil, and homemade chili oil. And that is the finished noodle bowl. Super delicious and comforting. And we've got leftover noodles for the next day, as well as leftover dashi for another meal as well. For the next meal, I'm starting off by making homemade furikake, which is a Japanese rice seasoning. I have the leftover kelp and katsuobushi from the dashi that I made. And I usually like to make this right after I make dashi while the ingredients are still just a little bit moist and haven't dried out yet. I'm gonna try and mince up this kelp as fine as I can get it to be. It's a little bit thick and slimy, which I know sounds gross, but it's totally fine. This is gonna dry out nicely when we fry it off in a pot. So just try and mince it as small as you can get it to be. And then you just throw this into a pot or frying pan along with the katsuobushi. And then we're basically just going to fry this off with a little bit of oil and salt and also a few teaspoons of sugar. And the goal is to have everything completely dried so that it's really dry and crispy and crunchy. I'm also going to add some sesame seeds. And I'm not really measuring anything. I will leave a link to a recipe that I've followed in the past, but I believe that there are many different kinds of furikake, so you can just create it based on what you have on hand and what you prefer. If you want more sesame seeds, you can do that, and if you want more seaweed, you can do that too. The only thing that I left out in that recipe that I used to follow is that I didn't add the soy sauce that it said, because in the past when I've made this with soy sauce, it gets a little bit gummy and I can't really get it to dry completely. And I found that this time when I left it out, I really liked the texture a lot better. The one last thing that I added as well is a sheet of nori, which I just shredded up into really small pieces. And then we're just gonna let this keep frying off until everything is completely dry. Making this after making dashi is another reason that I usually like to double my dashi recipe, because then I have a good amount of these leftover ingredients to make a nice big batch of furikake. This is normally used to sprinkle on top of rice, of course, which is why it's called a rice seasoning. It's also really good on noodle bowls. Like if I had this when I made our Dashi noodle bowl, I would have sprinkled some of this on top. And of course, I'm going to show you my favorite way to use it, which is on top of fried eggs and rice. If you've never had this before, really don't sleep on it because it is such good stuff. And seaweed is something that is not eaten a lot of in the American diet, and it's really good for you. It has a lot of good minerals such as iodine, which is especially important if you don't cook with iodized salt. Once everything's nice and toasty and crispy, I'm just going to transfer it into a jar. I would recommend storing this in the fridge just to make sure that it keeps well. I personally left it on the counter this time just because I felt that there was enough moisture evaporated out of there that I felt safe doing that. But if you just want to be on the safe side, I would just stick this in your fridge. So this is what it looks like, and now I'm going to show you my favorite way to use it. So I'm starting off with a cast iron pan with some oil, and I'm just frying off 2 eggs. I'm going to fry these over easy. As a general rule, I like my eggs to have runny yolks, but it is especially important and good in this recipe because later on we're going to drizzle a little bit of a sauce, and the yolks are going to mingle in with the sauce and the rice seasoning, and it's just going to be so good. I'm going to be serving this over a small bed of brown rice just because I'm trying to be healthy, but honestly, white rice is the best for this. So I have my eggs with my rice, and I'm just going to drizzle on some soy sauce, some sesame oil. You can also add chili oil if you want it, and then I'm just going to generously sprinkle some of my furikake on top, and it is just the perfect punch and something extra to make your fried eggs extra special. My favorite way to serve this is with some bok choy. I didn't have any, so I'm just doing some salad greens on the side. And when you pierce through that runny yolk, it kind of mixes with the soy sauce and the sesame oil, and then the rice seasoning gets in there, and it just makes this delicious mix that completely transforms what is actually a pretty simple dish. This meal I will most often cook for breakfast actually because I really like savory breakfast, but it's really great for any time of day. If you gave me a choice between like freshly baked cinnamon rolls and this, 9 times out of 10 I would choose this dish. It is just that good. But if you're not into savory breakfast, then you can just have this as a dinner or lunch, whatever. It's just a super easy meal. For the next meal, I'm going to go back to that other ball of pasta dough that I made in the beginning. This was 2 days later, which is why my pasta dough did kind of discolor a little bit. So if possible, it's best to use your dough within a day of making it. The egg in there can kind of discolor to a little bit of like this grayish color, which is fine to eat, it just is not very appealing. But life happens and I didn't get to my dough in time, so 2 days later will be just fine. This time I'm going to make more of like an Italian style pasta, and I'm going to be bringing out my pasta roller and using that. I have one of these tabletop pasta rollers that you can attach to the side of a table. And I am splitting my dough up into quarters and working with 1 quarter at a time. I'm going to kind of flatten it with my fingers and then run it through my pasta roller at the widest setting, which is 0 on mine. And then after you run it through once, fold it into thirds like a letter and run it through again on 0. And then just do this a couple of times. This helps to improve the texture, and it also helps you to get a nice rectangle shape so that all your noodles are more even in length. After you've run this through a few times on 0, you can crank it up to the next number, which is going to roll it a little bit thinner. And after that, you don't have to run it through multiple times. 1 time is usually enough on each setting, at least for me. And if I feel like there's not enough flour, I'll just continue to add flour as I'm rolling this out in between the settings. If it gets a little bit moist, it can kind of like stick to the roller, so I just like to be on the more careful side and add more flour as necessary. So I'm going to go through each of the settings one by one, and each time you run it through, it's going to get a little bit thinner and a little bit longer. If you need to split this in half so that it's more manageable, you can do that as well. And the thickness is completely up to you for what you want to use this for. Since I am making pasta noodles, I'm not going to go super thin. I went to the number 5 on my pasta roller, which is not quite thin enough for you to see through, but definitely a lot thinner than the first noodles that I made. If you were doing a stuffed pasta like a ravioli, you would probably want to go thin enough that you could start to see your hand through it. Once my entire sheet has been rolled through, I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to follow the same process for the other 3/4 of my dough and let those all sit on my cutting board before we move on to the second step for all of these sheets at once. An important part, don't forget to turn your roller back to the widest setting every time you start with a new piece of dough. I used to forget this all the time when I first learned to make pasta. And if you have the setting too thin in the beginning, it will kind of like shred your dough. So you want to make sure you always start at the widest one, do those few folds in the beginning, and then after that, it is easy going. You can just send it through each of the settings one at a time. Making pasta and noodles is definitely something that I want to get into more this year, especially now that we have chickens and I have plenty of eggs to use. This is a great way to use up eggs without feeling like you're eating eggs all the time. And of course, fresh homemade pasta is so good. It just has such a chewy texture that you can't really get with store-bought pasta. After I finish rolling out all of the pasta sheets, there is an attachment for my pasta maker to turn these into noodles, and this one has 2 different widths, a really skinny one and then one that's more like a fettuccine, and that's the one I'm going to be using today. So I'm just going to take my finished sheets and I like to coat this really nicely with flour before I send it through, because that way the noodles, when they come out of the attachment, will stay separated from each other. Otherwise they tend to kind of like clump back up. So it's nice to have it as dry as possible, and then we're just going to run it through the same way and it's going to come out as these beautiful long strips. I also find it really helpful to do this second step with pasta sheets that are slightly on the dry side, which is why I like to do all of my sheets at once through the first part, which is just making those whole sheets. And then by the time I get back to the first sheet to do this second step, it has kind of air dried just slightly so that it's not quite as tacky and it's a little bit easier to handle, and then the noodles don't stick together when they're formed into these fettuccine strips. After I've rolled my pasta into the noodles, I like to sprinkle it with a little bit more flour, again to keep them from sticking, and I just lay them in a nest on my cutting board since I am going to be cooking these fresh. If you weren't cooking these fresh, you could freeze these at this point and just boil them from frozen. Or you can air dry them, although I have never air dried before. I did try dehydrating and that definitely did not work. So I think stick to cooking fresh, freezing, or air drying. So I'm just going to continue on with the rest of the sheets, and this is the most fun part of the process because you go from a raw dough to homemade pasta, and it's just really fun and cool. It's also really nice that I was able to use the same dough from the first meal as I did for this one, because these are 2 completely different style finished recipes, but it's the same basic egg dough, and I was able to make a double batch of it on the first day. and let the dough rest in the fridge. And when I'm ready to make this pasta and to bring out my pasta roller, it's just like one step that has already been done that I don't have to stress about doing, because making homemade pasta, I will admit, is a little bit of a commitment. And if you can just break it down into multiple steps where you're not having to do everything all in one day, it really does make it a lot more manageable, if only just mentally. After all of my noodles are done, I have a pot of boiling water, and just like with dried box pasta, we're going to be adding plenty of salt into this so that it can flavor our noodles. And I'm going to be doing half of my batch at a time. And fresh pasta cooks very quickly, so it's only going to take a few minutes, depending on what shape and how thick your noodles are. So just give them a test to see if they're done. They should be perfectly bouncy. You don't want them to turn completely to mush, which will happen quickly with these fresh noodles. After these are done, instead of draining my pot, I'm just going to move my noodles directly into the bowls that I'm going to be serving them in, because the sauce that I'm using is going to be a pesto, which doesn't have to be cooked at all. That's another thing that I like to do if I'm making fresh noodles. I like to dress them with a sauce or a soup base that I've already prepared previously, because it's just one less thing for me to have to worry about. I'm already making pasta from scratch. I don't want to go through the process of making a really elaborate sauce as well. I also don't worry about completely draining my noodles, because any leftover pasta water that clings to those noodles is going to help to combine our pesto or whatever sauce we're using later on. So here's the pesto I'm going to be using. It's a pesto I made with homegrown basil and arugula, and this was just in the freezer, and I pulled it out and defrosted it for this meal. And pesto just makes for a really quick, nice sauce. All you have to do is mix it in, and the heat of the pasta along with any of that residual water will help to blend the pesto with the pasta really nicely. If you've only made basil pesto, I would encourage you to try throwing different things into your pesto. You can use so many different herbs and greens to make pesto. This was my first time trying one with arugula, and it's really good. I love that like kind of peppery kick that the arugula has in there. I also really like to make pesto with kale, and sometimes I'll include spinach. So there's just a lot of different ways that you can make it, and you can throw in a bunch of really nutritious greens in there, depending on what is growing in your garden at that time. And here's the finished dish. The homemade pasta is so good and has such a nice eggy flavor and bouncy texture. And I served this along with some leftover soup that I had in the fridge. This soup has sausage, chickpeas, farro, carrots, potatoes, so just a whole bunch of nice veggies that I thought would complement our pasta really nicely. For our last meal, we're going to be making some egg drop soup along with a stir fry. For my soup, I'm starting off with a quart of vegetable broth, and I'm also putting some other things in this egg drop soup. I am adding a container of wintermelon that I had from the freezer, along with some salt and plenty of white pepper. I'm gonna let this come to a boil before I add anything else, because that wintermelon was straight from the freezer, so it was really cold and frozen. Meanwhile, I'm going to work on my stir fry. In a pan with some oil, I'm adding a dried chili along with some diced onion. And then I'm going to be adding some homegrown frozen vegetables. Oh, before I do that, I am going to add a few sticks of imitation crab meat to my soup. This is an addition that I really like that makes it almost like a seafood soup that you would get at a Chinese restaurant if you were having like a Chinese banquet sort of meal. The imitation crab sort of breaks apart in the soup, and I really like the texture of it. So anyway, back to the stir fry. I am adding some silk squash, also known as Chinese okra, and then I am also adding some Asian yard-long beans. The main flavoring component for the stir fry is going to be this black bean garlic sauce, which has a really savory flavor. It's a fermented black bean, and it's also really salty, so just a teaspoon of this will be enough for this pan of vegetables. This sauce is pretty readily available. I think I've even seen it at like Walmart, so it should be pretty easy to find, and it's a really nice, easy way to add flavor to stir fry, and I use it all the time. While that stir fry is going and my soup is boiling, I'm going to prepare a cornstarch slurry for the soup. I have about 3 tablespoons of cornstarch here, and I'm going to add about a 1/4 cup of water. And egg drop soup has that really thick, viscous kind of texture, and we're going to achieve that with this slurry. I also decided to add some dried shrimp to my stir fry. Not necessary at all, I just had them in my fridge, so I thought I would throw that in for a little bit more of a savory seafood kind of flavor. And now at this point, my soup has been boiling for a while and that wintermelon looks pretty much cooked and is getting translucent. So I'm going to add that cornstarch slurry in there, mix it in, and let it come back up to a boil. As it boils, it's going to cook that cornstarch and it's going to thicken up the soup. Here's the consistency I'm going to go with. You can definitely add more of that cornstarch slurry if you like it a little bit thicker. I know when you get this at a restaurant, it can be quite a bit thicker than this, but I'm gonna leave it at this because I think it's fine. And now I have a few beaten eggs, and we're going to slowly drizzle this into the soup while it is hot and boiling. And I'm gonna like kind of stir the pot while I'm doing this so that the soup is moving. And as we stream this in, the eggs are going to cook and form those nice long strands that are the essence of egg drop soup. This has definitely been one of our favorite soups recently. Erin has requested it more than once. It's really easy to make, and with the addition of the wintermelon as well, it is packed full of nutrients and good veggies, and it's really nice and hearty. And here is the finished meal. We have a nice big bowl of our egg drop soup. I served this along with some brown rice and also a salt cured egg. I haven't shown how to make this yet, but I will in the future. And also our stir fry with the silk squash and Asian yard long beans. This makes for such a nice complete meal. It's very comforting and quick and easy to put together, so it's great for weeknights. So those are the meals that I cooked this week. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again in the next one.